we are honored this evening to have the Reverend and Dr. Gloria White Hammond as our speaker. Dr. White Hammond has a Bachelor of Arts degree in biology from Boston University, a Doctorate of Medicine from Tufts Medical School, and a Master of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School. For many years, she has served as a pediatrician in the Community Health Center of Boston's South End, a neighborhood with great need. She recently left that post and has become the executive director of My Sister's Keeper, and I'll say a word about that in a moment. With her husband, the Reverend Dr. Ray Hammond, Dr. White Hammond also co-pastors the Bethel African Methodist, better try that again, Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Boston's Jamaica Plain. On several occasions, my wife Jan and I have seen firsthand how warm and engaging Dr. White Hammond is. Admired across academic, philanthropic, and Christian circles throughout Boston, she is a caring and humble and real person. She also has a deep compassion that extends well beyond local boundaries. She established the extraordinary organization My Sister's Keeper in southern Sudan, a ministry that now supports a school for girls and has developed 2 grinding mill projects in that country. In addition, she is the co-chair of the Massachusetts Coalition to Save Darfur. Last month, at the Save Darfur rally in Boston, Dr. White Hammond inspired the crowd to continue the long fight against genocide in that region. She cited the story of a 70-year-old woman who lived in Montgomery, Alabama during the famous boycott, the bus boycott in the 1950s. When offered a ride one day, she refused it, saying, "My feet are tired, but my soul is rested." When I think of all the boards that Dr. White Hammond sits on, the countless medical patients she has cared for through the years, the dozens of ministry trips she takes, and the hundreds of church members she pastors, I think, Dr. White Hammond, your feet must be tired too. But when I hear her speak, I know her soul is rested in Christ Jesus our Lord. Please join me in welcoming the Reverend and Dr. Gloria White Hammond to Gordon College.
Thank you, thank you. Let me begin, first of all, of course, by honoring God for the privilege of being with you all this evening. And certainly, I want to extend my congratulations to the class of 2009 of the great Gordon College. Y'all are some bad mamma jammas. And I certainly want to honor your parents for the sacrifice of love that you've made on behalf of your children. I want to extend my appreciation to the trustees of Gordon College for extending to me the privilege of standing before you all this evening, and certainly to my friends and colleagues, President Judd and First Lady Jan Carlberg. It's said that the world will be easier if we can say in the end that we walk this road together hand in hand with a friend. And in Judd and Jan, we have 2 good friends, and I'm so grateful to God for the experiences that we've shared over the years. To God be the glory for the great things he has done in and through you. And I'm certainly grateful, especially today, to have among us my best friend, my honey bun, my boo, the Reverend Dr. Ray Hammond. After 35 years and 10 months and 29 days and about 5 hours, he still makes me weak in the knees. Now, over the years, I have been privileged to deliver several commencement speeches, and I will tell you that this year has been particularly difficult. The class of 2009 is America's largest graduating class to date. Some 1.6 million of you are leaving here facing what we recognize as the worst unemployment rate in a generation. And so instead of making your way into the real world, some of you will be returning home to live with your parents. Yet there is a word from the Lord as recorded in this book of Hebrews in the 10th chapter. As we reflect on this chapter's call to persevere, I would ask that you would pray with me on a charge that has sustained me over the years in my ministries, both local and global, and that is quite simply, just do it. Now, while today's theme is often identified with Nike, you know Nike, the athletic gear Nike, I would submit that rather than paying a bunch of advertising executives millions of dollars to come up with this logo, they simply lifted it from the time-worn book that has been passed down through generations of parents. The Handbook for Parents. It's comprised of all those sayings that you promised as you would never say when you grew up and became a parent and had kids of your own. My own personal favorite is, I brought you into this world, and I can show enough take you. And so just do it as a short version of one of those statements that you promised you wouldn't say. But despite how proud of you we are today, I suspect that all of the parents, can I get the parents to just raise your hands? You can testify that every now and then you all have caused us to go there. And after asking you to do something over and over again, you, our bright and gifted hopes for the world's tomorrow, suddenly seem to be the deaf, mute, blind, and ignorant of our today. And your uncooperative attitude every now and then would mount up on wings like eagles and soar to a path that leads directly to our very last nerve. And after enduring a litany of excuses, the collective wisdom of Dr. Dobson, the Proverbs 31 woman, and Oprah herself would become patently irrelevant, and before we knew what would happen, we would hear the words of our mothers blaring from our mouths to you, our children. No ifs, no ands, no buts, just. Surely, this logo summarizes the text of the book of Hebrews. This open letter, most commonly attributed to Paul, was written to the early Christians who faced great persecution. Persecution was part of the package for the early Christians. They faced jeers and flogging. Some were chained and imprisoned. They were stoned, sawed in two, put to death by sword for the sake of the gospel of Jesus Christ. They experienced perilous times, and by God's grace, they persevered. They were hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned. And by God's grace, and because of their courage and their faith and their determination, the church not only survived, it thrived. But then, after a while, and by, some grew weary in well-doing. They were tired, and they were sick and tired, and they were sick and tired of being sick and tired, as once again the opposition began to escalate. And so many were prepared to, in fact, give up the faith, to slip back into the status quo, to retreat to business as usual, safe inside the box according to the rules. And then in the 10th chapter of Hebrews, the writer meets them at that fork in the road and issues this especially poignant challenge. Remember where you've come from, what God has brought you through, and do not throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. You need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what God has promised. No ifs, no ands, no buts, just. How, preacher, do we do it in the midst of these economic times? How do we do it when our world is besieged with wars and rumors of wars? How do we just do it? I want to suggest a three-pronged strategy that I have learned over the years. Step up with courage, step out on faith, and step forward with determination. You must just do it. You must step up with courage. For the past 8 years, you've heard that I have devoted much of my time and talent and treasure to advocating on behalf of the great people of Sudan. You have no doubt heard about the crisis in Darfur in Western Sudan, what the previous administration labeled a genocide. Perhaps as many as 400,000 have died and 2.5 million people have been displaced in this brutal war that pits the largely Arab Muslim government in Khartoum against non-Arab Muslims. However, this genocidal brutality that we have heard about in Darfur is by no means new to Sudan. Before the genocide in Western Sudan, there was the genocide in Southern Sudan and the genocide in the central region of Sudan in the Numa Mountains, all of which were facilitated by the current Sudanese government. Since 2001, I have made now more than a dozen trips into Southern Sudan and Darfur and Chad to document the terror. In South Sudan, I've encountered thousands of women and children who were captured during the war and taken into the north where they were sold into slavery. Subsequently, they returned to their villages through a very elaborate underground railroad through which their freedom was purchased for the going rate of $33 per slave. Yes, for about the cost of a standing room ticket in Fenway Park, you too could purchase the freedom of a woman. The returnees convey tales of abject horror. In my earliest days of traveling to Sudan, quite honestly, it was a fear-filled experience, not because of the very real external dangers associated with traveling into a war zone, but because of the fears of inadequacy that loomed within me. One day during my second trip was particularly difficult. It was a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. I was nagged by the sight of an 11-year-old cowherder whose face was rendered utterly grotesque by his former master. Angry that the boy had lost a cow, his master took an axe and chopped off the boy's nose. I spent the night tossing and turning, and yes, crying. How could I begin to confront the profound depth of such a crisis? How could I tell the world about this? It was a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. And then God showed up, as God is so prone to do. And he ministered to me in the sense of my inadequacy. He said that I was exactly in the place that he needed me to be. It did not feel like a good place, but it was a God place. If you live long enough, you will meet a God place. The God place is where you hit a wall, and you realize that you have to make a choice between succumbing to fear or stepping up in courage. The God place is where you come to know that you know that you know. What Mother Teresa has said to regard it as the fact that Jesus is all you need because Jesus is all you have. It's a God place. And then God reminded me of my great sheroes, of Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer, and how they stepped up with courage in a struggle, the fruit of which has resulted in the first African-American president of the United States of America. And God said, "You don't come from people who shrink back. You don't come from people who give up in the face of opposition and are destroyed, but of those who believe in the power of an awesome God and are saved." And so after my second trip, the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad one, I co-founded My Sister's Keeper as an effort that allows American women to partner with Sudanese women in the difficult work of advocating for peace and rebuilding their communities. And in 2 weeks, Ray and I will return to South Sudan And we will dedicate the new campus that was constructed by my sister's keeper. It began 5 years ago with 100 girls, and when we return, we will greet 1,000 girls in our primary school that will now house their school as well as our Women's Peace School and Adult Women's Literacy Project. Somebody needs to give God some praise. And not only must we step out with courage, we must also step out on faith. Because world changers have to have a special kind of faith. And you've heard I've been a pediatrician now for almost 30 years. And I've come to have a special regard for the special kind of faith that a kid has. I have become convinced that just as there are no atheists in the foxhole, there are also no atheists on the playground, on the teeter-totter, or the merry-go-round. I've come over the years of ministry to be interested in the difference between when an adult comes to Christ and when a child comes to Christ. Adults often come when life has finished beating them up, and they come to Jesus as a process of elimination. There's no other place to go. But when a kid comes and you ask them, why are you coming today? Well, it just makes sense. Jesus loves me, and I want to love him back. That's the kind of faith that we're talking about. That's the kind of faith that will get us through hard times, that will speak promise to pain and hope to hopelessness. In my second year of residency, I met a young girl named Elizabeth. She was 5 years old from Maine. She had developed one of the worst forms of leukemia, for which we quite honestly could not cure, but only buy her more time. During her frequent hospitalizations, we became good buddies. Now, you understand that oftentimes the treatment for these diseases is worse than the disease itself. And so one morning, Elizabeth's mother greeted us on rounds. She said through the night she had felt haunted by the fact that she just did not want to put Elizabeth through these treatments anymore, could no longer endure the indignity and the pain of the best that we had to offer. She couldn't imagine how she could deny Elizabeth even a few more months. And that same morning, Elizabeth woke up and said, "Mommy, I don't want to do this anymore." And so the two of them announced their decision to our pediatric staff. They stood firm and went on home to Maine, their beloved Maine. Several months later, while I was walking through the halls of the oncology ward, I heard an unusual sound. It was singing and laughter coming from one of the rooms. We don't do that on the cancer floor. I peeked in to discover Elizabeth and her mom and several friends and nurses. And they were all donning party hats, and there were balloons, and there was a birthday cake in the room. And Elizabeth explained to me why she was having a party. She said that she had been praying, and she paused to explain to me the definition of praying. She said, praying is when you talk to God. And this is what's so profound about what this 5-year-old girl said. And she said, and God talks back to you. And God had told her 3 things: that she was going to go to heaven, and she was going to see her grandmother, and she wasn't going to be sick anymore. And because Elizabeth, with her pure kid's faith, believed God, the party was on. That's what Christ is talking about when he says, in order to get into the kingdom, we have to become like one of these. Because these are the kind that have the faith that you can step out on to pierce the darkness of even the most challenging times. Several months later, Elizabeth's mother paged me to come down to the lobby, and when I greeted her, she had a black Raggedy Ann doll. Now, Elizabeth was white, and she explained to me what I had not realized before, that I was the first black person that Elizabeth had ever met. And when they went back to Maine, they stumbled upon a black Raggedy Ann doll. Now, this was about 30 years ago, so that was probably the only black Raggedy Ann doll in the state of Maine. And Elizabeth named the doll Dr. Gloria. And before she died, she made out a will, and she willed Dr. Gloria to me, and her mother was bringing her so that we could meet. And now Dr. Gloria sits in my favorite chair of my study to remind me that as we face difficult challenges, both personally and professionally, at home and in this country, that God will not leave nor forsake us, that we can step out on faith and just. Finally, it remains nevertheless that the work does get wearying, and when that happens, I am used to God sending an angel, and usually a child, to propel us to step forward with determination. A few years ago, I came to the end of what was a very frustrating day. I had spent the morning unsuccessfully searching for alternative housing for one of my kids with asthma, a very brittle asthmatic, who was housed in Children's Hospital ICU once again. His asthma is compromised by the fact that he lived in a third-floor walk-up that was roach and rat infested. My afternoon began trying to access social services for a little 4-year-old whom I had discovered had been sexually abused. All of my referral sources told me to take a number. The wait would be long. By the end of the day, I was seriously wanting Scotty to beam me up. Maria was a 12-year-old girl, my last client, who had recently immigrated from Guatemala. In order to assess how well kids are adjusting to the new culture, I've learned to speak English to them. But Maria kept shaking her head, no, no, and her mother said she was muy tímida. She was very shy, and so I sympathized with Maria and invited her to go behind the examining curtain so that we could get ready for the exam. And as she undressed, her mom and I continued to talk, and her mom said that she was a pastora, and I said, well, I'm a minister too. And so she marveled at that. You're a doctor and a pastor, yes, and you're married, yes, with children too. Amazing, she noted. Well, challenging. And I began to whine and complain about how hard it is to help people during these very difficult times. Suddenly, the curtain flew back, and there was Maria, and now she is elegantly dressed in her blue paper gown. What was so remarkable about her, she had her hand on her hip, her head was bobbing, she pointed her finger at me, and she said in letter-perfect English, "You go, girl!" And so, in any language, that sounds like profound wisdom for all of us who have to be committed to confronting today's challenge. You go, girl, you go, dude. Clip the ifs, can the ands, kick the butts, and just do it. Thank you.